This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. We have yet another installment of Hollywood Hates History today. This is a collaboration that I've been doing with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast and others on the very best and, of course, very worst history-based movies. Let's see if Hollywood hates history today. And for today, I mounted a brave defense of a lone outpost of the movie podcast internet. I will make my stand to defend The Alamo from 2004, starring Billy Bob Thornton, Patrick Wilson, and many others. The Battle of the Alamo is really one of the most iconic battles and probably events in American and possibly world history. Everyone just loves the story of the underdog who fights to the end despite overwhelming odds. But does this movie do the story justice? You'll have to be the judge of that today. If you have historical movies you love or hate, let me know, and maybe we can make it into an episode for Hollywood Hates History. I have a few other movies in the works with both Scott Rank and other people. If you'd like to participate in Hollywood Hates History, because everybody has a movie of history-based movie. If you're listening to this podcast series, you have historical movies you love and hate. All you have to do is just send me an email to steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our series where we're looking at the most historically inaccurate movies that have ever been made. Steve, I'm really interested in digging into this movie because when you mention the Alamo to people of a certain age, I'm thinking, Gen Xers or maybe older millennials in the 40s, 30s age range. And you mentioned the Alamo. What almost anyone will mention is Pee-wee's Big Adventure, where Texans laugh at Pee-wee because he asked if the Alamo has a basement, and they tell him that it doesn't. And then they'll know the phrase, remember the Alamo, but with no context whatsoever about what that means. So are you excited about peeling back many, many layers of what the Alamo is, both in historical fact and in film as well?
Absolutely. In this movie, The Alamo from 2004, I loved it. And I think it's actually one of the movies, I don't know if you could quite say it's the most historically accurate movie, but it really tried the hardest, I think, of any movie to pretty much make a good story and stay historically accurate. I'll quickly do a little overview. What's interesting about this movie is with the overview, they told the history of the Alamo, and I'll add a little bit into their things that maybe the movie didn't add in, but I'll give a little bit more context. Just really quickly, this is yet another Alamo movie. There was the John Wayne version from the 50s, and then there was I believe it was a made-for-TV movie which starred Alec Baldwin, of all people, as William Barrett Travis, which he did a really awesome job. I don't think there was any other really big actors in that one, but that was like the standout, that Alec Baldwin did a great job as William Travis. Now, this Alamo, it has the usual all-star cast that one expects from a great historical period piece movie. You have Dennis Quaid as Sam Houston, and Houston has a larger role in this movie than most Alamo movies. Billy Bob Thornton as Davy Crockett, Patrick Wilson as William Travis, and Jason Patric as Jim Bowie.
The T-1000, Jason Patric, yes.
Yes. and then Jordi Moya as Juan Seguin. And if you don't recognize his name, you'll definitely recognize his face. He's been in a lot of movies in the 90s and the 2000s. And then there's a number of famous actors from Spanish language TV and film, which I thought was a nice touch. This movie had a huge budget, but unfortunately was kind of a box office flop. The purported goal of the filmmakers was to have this movie be as historically accurate as possible. And it kind of had a tough job of it because it was always under the shadow of the John Wayne version of the Alamo, which is kind of taken over as the canonical story of the Alamo, no matter what the history of the actual events were.
I'm guessing with John Wayne, having not seen that version, is it any better than The Conqueror in terms of historical accuracy?
It's been a long time since I saw it. They do the standard Davy Crockett wearing the coonskin cap, which that was more of a costume than anything, and wearing the really traditional 1950s movies of leather breeches and a leather jacket, which I think that those in more of a Native American Indian style that was not contemporary to the 1830s. Again, more of the Davy Crockett costume than actual history. But I think that movie, for everything, stayed somewhat historically accurate. I think they made the Mexican army more as a classic villain and didn't try and give them more of a 3D picture. But we'll get into that definitely with this Alamo.
Yeah, I mean, the Davy Crockett, obviously you're not going to wear your frontier log cabin getup when you're in the middle of an active war zone and you've served as a U.S. Senator. But anyway, that movie's probably gone and buried. So let's go to, better, greener pastures with this one. So yeah, I know you have a lot of historical context, but I think it's good to make sense of what this movie gets right and wrong. So what's the background of the Alamo, despite it additionally not having a basement?
Now, as I was saying, the movie actually discusses a good chunk of this setup on the road to the Alamo. Now, starting in the late 1600s, we're going way back, the Spanish began to seriously explore and colonize Texas, and they used their standard method of building a system of missions and presidios, mostly along the major rivers, like the San Antonio River. The missions were religious and economic and cultural centers, and friars, mostly Dominicans and Franciscans, would set up a church, farming, school facilities, all in an enclosed area in these missions. And the local Native Americans were encouraged to move into the missions, and they had some incentive to do so. Things were getting pretty rough in Texas. More warlike Native American groups, they were moving in from the north, and they had horses and horse movement really wrecked through these settled Native Americans, more settled, who didn't have horse technology yet. And there was some different things going on climatically that were making more of Texas plains, as opposed to, a lot of the bigger trees were dying off. Now, so the local Native Americans, they needed food, they needed shelter, they needed protection from these other groups. And really, in order to go into these missions, the Native Americans had to adopt Christianity, learn Spanish, and then physically live inside of these missions and learn to farm using Spanish methods, and basically drop their old culture and language and all that stuff. So a lot of the Native Americans obviously didn't dig that as much. But in this story, that's a different issue. Now, like I said, the missions they provided some level of protection from raids and limited attacks, but they were not defensive structures by any stretch of the imagination. They were meant to hold out long enough to get support from the local presidio, and presidios were defensive structures or fortresses with troops and military logistics, and that's where the governors would live, and that's where the secular government would be. The Spanish San Antonio, modern day San Antonio, had several missions in close proximity, and then a presidio. The Alamo was one of these missions, and it was located in pretty much modern-day downtown San Antonio, and it was just outside of the actual town of San Antonio, which was a little south of there. And then the governor's palace in Presidio was about a mile or so west of the Alamo. And over the years, the Alamo was used in different capacities, including housing soldiers and cannons, and then it became somewhat of a fort. But keep in mind, it was never designed to be a fort, and that's the situation of probably the most important character of this movie and the whole story of the Alamo, which is the Alamo itself. Now, fast forwarding to the 1800s, Mexico became independent from Spain on September 16th of 1810. And just a little side note, Cinco de Mayo, which I always thought was Mexican Independence Day.
Very common mistake in the United States, yes.
Yeah, that marks a completely different historical event much later in history, about 75, maybe about close to 30 years after this, but completely independent. But anyways, the Constitution of Mexico of 1810 gave Mexico a really weak central government, and the various states of Mexico had a great deal of autonomy. And a place like the Mexican state of Tejas, what they call Texas, was in practice almost a completely independent country from Mexico City.
Yeah, and at this time period, in terms of economic development, I don't know if Mexico is comparable or even richer than the United States, but it had definitely been settled and colonized and established much longer, 1 to 2 centuries longer of serious active colonization with city building. So some of the colonial style cities that still exist in Mexico, like Merida or others, I think date back to the 16th century or so. So there's it'd be interesting. I don't know when America would pass Mexico in terms of economic development. That'd probably be well into the 19th century when industrialization moves on full force and the economy switches from agrarian, a more like Russian style of doing cash crops and other things, to industrialization. But I could see the draw to Mexico at that time.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors. And militarily, Mexico was much more developed than the United States military at that time. So I would say for sure economically, militarily, and definitely even in government structure. I mean, Mexico had structures of government that, like you said, went back 200 plus years into the even longer than that. And cultural institutions. But that during this 1810s through 1820s and then into the 1830s, many Americans started to move into the really sparsely settled area of Texas. I think in the 1830s, there was only about 30,000 people living in Texas at that time, which made it by far the smallest state of Mexico. Most of the immigrants came from the southeastern part of the United States. And you look at some of the famous early Anglo-Texans called Texians, where they were from. Stephen Austin and Sam Houston were from Virginia. Davy Crockett was from Tennessee. Jim Bowie was from Kentucky. William Travis and his cousin James Bonham, they are from South Carolina, all in the southeastern section of the United States, which also happened to be the area where slavery was an important institution. And most of these Anglo-Texians, they weren't just coming from economic reasons, which they brought their slaves. And just as a side note, which would become very important, Mexico had already banned and abolished slavery by this point. So that was a little bit of a sticking point early, right off the bat, basically. But a lot of these Anglo-Texans, they were also fleeing to evade criminal prosecutions, debt, civil injunctions, really like terrible family matters. Like these weren't high-end people moving to set up stable economies and social structures. Most of the people who were going to Texas were fleeing, running from something.
That's a proud tradition of many of the people who originally immigrated to the United States from Europe were coming for similar reasons. So you know what? We're just paying it forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And the main agent for the Mexican government to recruit Anglo immigrants to come to Texas was a man named Stephen Austin. And he had authority from Mexico City to bring 300 families to settle. But once these families started settling and they started to settle legally, others came illegally to settle in the wide open spaces. I mean, you're just talking, there wasn't a very clearly defined border between Mexico and the United States. So it was just easy for people to come and go through the porous border.
Yeah, that's a fact not lost on, I think, many history teachers. I like to point that out. And I've heard that in my own college experience of illegal immigration to Mexico from the United States. Very low-hanging fruit to pick, which, to this movie's credit, it doesn't pick it as ferociously as a lesser movie would have, but we can get to that later.
Yeah. Now all these immigrants, they brought their slaves, and which I said, like I was saying, was abolished by the Mexican federal government. And this is where we see some major players come in. The federal Mexican government, which was solidifying power under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and the Texians, we'll call them Texans, and that was broken into two groups. The Anglos, called the Texians, and the Mexicans, called Tejanos. The Texians and the Tejanos, they both had reasons to dislike the central government, and that's really what kickstarted the Texas Revolution. I think that's something, too, that most other tellings of the Alamo, we'll get into like historicity and all that stuff, but it was a movement of both Tejanos and Texians who wanted independence from the central Mexican government.
Yeah, interesting hybrid culture there. So different reasons to distrust the central authority and the weak hold that the central government has on it up into the north, perhaps them hoping it would be a buffer state due to it being hot and arid and sparsely populated, like the way the Roman Empire had the Sahara, thinking that this can ward off any attacks from the south and we can have our African coastal cities. Sorry, Mexico, not to be. It's contiguous land area, so that's not going to work.
Yeah. Now, this leads us to the road to the Alamo. The Texan army had some initial successes because the Mexican army did not have a lot of troops or supplies or anything they really needed in Texas at that time. The Texans took some key towns, including San Antonio. Now, this was during the dead of winter, and they didn't expect the Mexican army to be able to respond until spring. A lot of this happened in late fall, early winter, and they thought that they had a good 5-6 months before, the Mexican army could really get rolling. But Santa Anna, who was known as the Napoleon of the West, he didn't stand around for a second. He was convinced that the professional Mexican army would just steamroll over the ragtag bunch of backwoodsmen of the Texan army. The Mexican army had to march all the way from central Mexico to Texas through some pretty rough terrain. It's a lot of desert throughout there. There's mountains, there's plateaus, rough country, basically all the way from Mexico City to Texas. And the logistics of moving a really large army through northern Mexico, they were not prepared for in the least bit. And that really hurt the army. And although the winter in Texas, you may not compare it to maybe you say Russia or upstate New York, or I think even where you live, you get some pretty rough winters, don't you?
It's happened. This last winter was pretty rough. So we get our 6 to 8 to 12 inches of snow occasionally.
Yeah, you wouldn't think of that in Texas, but the winter of 1836 was pretty severe by Texas standards, and it set record colds and snowfall even pretty far deep into northern Mexico. Santa Anna, he had a no mercy policy because the Texans were rebels and he was going to treat them as rebels. So when the army took a fort or met any resistance, they were not taking prisoners. And that leads us to the Battle of the Alamo.
Right. And then with their supply lines stretched so thin, it'd be very hard to accommodate prisoners or do anything with them. So it's sort of a pragmatism, but then also sending a very clear message to any other would-be rebels or any would-be Americans trying to settle illegally there, since they don't have strong fortifications to defend it. So,
yeah.
All right, so let's get to the movie itself and see how closely it hews to the overview that you just gave.
So there's a lot of setup there, but I think it's important to understand where things stood right before the battle. And the movie develops a lot of what I said in that conflict in the plot, but not entirely. Like, they didn't get into the mission system and all that, but they got into the biographies of a lot of people like William Travis. For example, he was the commander of the regular Texas Army soldiers at the Alamo, and he was a real prince. He abandoned his family in South Carolina and just left all of his debts with his wife, which I don't believe he ever saw her again after he had left. He did have some connections with his son, Jim Bowie. He had a checkered background, and he bopped all around the southeastern U.S., getting into fights and conflicts with his gigantic Bowie knife, which is named after him. And I think he had been stabbed several times. He still had bullets lodged in his body. And I think he was leaving some sort of like debt situation. And Bowie was the commander of the volunteer contingent at the Alamo. David Crockett, he was a U.S. congressman who ran into some political troubles in Washington. I think it went back to, he had a fallout with Andrew Jackson, I believe. And there was all sorts of stuff that had been going on in the 1830s within the Democratic Party. But his district back in Tennessee voted him out of office. And even at this point, Crockett was way more legend than man. And he had a famous line, "You can all go to hell and I shall go to Texas." And he told that all around the parties in Washington. And they showed some part of his scene with Billy Bob Thornton. I think that was the star of the movie. He did such a great job as Crockett, as somebody who was a cynical politician, but also knew he was a legend. You know, he was a hybrid of politician and backwoodsman. He was all of those things at one time. And I think Billy Bob Thornton just did a great job folding that all together.
Yeah, good guy to play a skinny, wiry, really crazy guy. He nailed it. And with Davy Crockett's personality, there's, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a Teddy Roosevelt, maybe not quite the polish of Teddy. The knowing representation of himself as a backwoodsman to really try to sell the frontier spirit that he has. He was an actual frontiersman, but he was also doing marketing, sort of like when Benjamin Franklin was an ambassador in France and would wear a coonskin cap, even though he had never lived in a cabin and probably never slept in one his entire life. Crockett had more claim to that, but like Franklin, also a bit of a showman.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Davy Crockett was everything that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be. But we could lose a lot of listeners if we bash Teddy Roosevelt too much.
Yeah, I mean, he did he was rough, don't get me wrong, but he liked to play cowboy in some senses, and he actually did up in Montana for a few years, North Dakota.
Yeah. Now, this divided command structure between regulars led by Travis and the volunteers led by Bowie, you've got two really big personalities, and then you have the regulars who think they're better than the volunteers, and the volunteers who think they're better than the regulars. I mean, they were ready to fight each other before they were going to fight the Mexicans. And, Travis thought that he should be in overall command because he was the leader of the regulars. And Bowie, on the other hand, was extremely popular and was seen to be the better fighter. Some also thought that Crockett should take command, and he kind of demurred away from all of that. But the practical matter was solved when Bowie, he became very sick shortly into the siege. And the siege took just about a week. And for all the heroics, the battle only lasted a few hours. the Alamo just wasn't made to be a defensive structure, and the defenders really didn't have the time or the resources to truly set it up to defend itself against the cannons and the siege equipment that the Mexican army had. Now, William Travis, he was killed very early in the action, and eventually the Mexicans took the entire fort. Only a handful of defenders survived, and, they basically, when the Mexican Federals went into when they finally did break through the walls, they just killed everyone on the spot. Somewhere about 6 defenders survived, and this movie included Davy Crockett amongst that small number of survivors. First-hand accounts show that Crockett died in the fighting, but there's also a controversy since the day of the March 6th of 1836, whether Crockett died fighting or was executed the next day. There's a really big controversy over that. But one way or the other, Crockett did die, and over 200 of the defenders died or were executed at the Alamo.
Yeah, I wonder what historians do with sources. I would assume that any accounts that we have would come from the Mexican side, since they survived and the Americans did not. Or if there are other sources that we do have, since nobody would have left it there, and we're faced with what's that situation? It was about 2,000 years ago in Israel when they were fighting against the Romans, and there was a mass suicide.
Masada?
Yeah, that's right. So it would be the Roman. So I don't know one way or another, and I would assume the Mexican accounts are what we have, but perhaps I could be wrong.
There's also, they touched on this in the movie, the Mexican army, they were not to kill African-American slaves. They were to be taken and then freed. And Jim Bowie's slave, I don't know if he escaped or if he was caught in the Alamo, and then he was brought to Santa Ana. And I believe he was one of the ones who was at when they were executing, and I want to say that he said that he didn't see Crockett there.
Oh, okay. That's good.
But I could be, that one, I'm just shooting from the hip here, and I'm not he was one of the witnesses. There was a couple, I think one of the people who wrote shortly afterwards, the general consensus is that Crockett died in the fort. The movie actually went with the theory that he died outside of the fort the next day. Okay, so they're at least hitching their cart to a horse that is, part of one camp of respectable opinion. And the other thing, too, about one of Jim Bowie's slaves, I would imagine that the Mexican army had a policy and would want slaves to get word of, join us and you will be emancipated. I don't know if they did that or not, but that is a time-honored strategy that's used by the Union, made it known to any slaves in the Confederacy. It's used in the Revolutionary War, where the British make it known to slaves that if you get behind our lines and fight for us, you will be emancipated. So it's a way to try to sap the manpower and maybe stir up a revolt to weaken your enemy forces. So, yep, Mexico is prosecuting a pretty smart war here. Yeah, they're treating them like rebels. And you know what? Well, we'll see in a few minutes whether that strategy completely worked or not. Now, the defenders of the Alamo, they were really never supposed to defend the Alamo the way they did. They did tie up Santa Anna's forces for some amount of time, but not really for very long. And a lot of people died in the meanwhile. Later in March, Santa Anna fought it out in another town, a little village about 100 miles south and east of the Alamo called Goliad. And another group of Texans tried to fight toe-to-toe with the Mexican army, and that didn't work out well at all either. The Texans were soundly defeated at Goliad, and again, no mercy was granted to the Texan commanders or soldiers. Santa Anna ordered approximately 430 captured soldiers to be summarily executed as rebels, just like the Alamo defenders. And it's probably worth saying that a lot of the Mexican commanders did not want to do this. They were really against this policy, and they thought it was against the rules of war, and were not happy to do Santa Anna's biddings on that issue. In the meanwhile, Sam Houston was given command of the Texan army, and they were able to organize and get somewhat of their stuff together, so to speak. Houston always wanted to use hit and run strategy against the Mexican armies, and then to just keep drawing them in to lead them to a place where he knew he could have the upper hand, because he knew they could never go toe-to-toe fighting the Mexican Federals against, using the Mexicans' battle strategy. It was just never going to work. But that hit and run and running basically strategy was not super popular with many Texans, because they wanted instant revenge for all their family and friends and neighbors who had been massacred, not only at the Alamo, but also at Goliad. But Houston was able to hold out, and Houston was able to lead Santa Anna along a series of several small battles, which was called the Runaway Scrape. And finally, Houston found the right ground at a place called San Jacinto, where the Texas Army just hit the Mexicans hard when they were resting in their camp. And I believe the Mexicans had set their camp up on the side of the opposite side, or the side of the river where the Texas Army was. So they didn't have the river for defense. The river was actually at their back. And the Texas Army just ripped through their camp. And there was also Tejanos that were a part of that battle as well, which Sam Houston initially didn't want the Tejanos to fight with them, because he was afraid that the Texians might turn on them. And they had done something, I believe they put a card in their hats that distinguished them from the Mexican Federals, and they portrayed that in the movie, which I thought was a nice touch. The Battle of San Jacinto only lasted 20 minutes, and the entire Mexican army was destroyed, and many of their top commanders, including Santa Anna, were captured. There were definitely acts of no mercy from the Texans, but Sam Houston wanted Santa Anna alive, and he wanted to show that he was the bigger man and that the Texans were, more honorable than the Mexicans. So even despite that the Texans wanted to kill Santa Anna on the spot, Houston refused, and he was able to get Santa Anna to grant Texas independence from Mexico on very favorable terms right on the spot. And that's in a nutshell the entire movie. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
All right. Yeah. Very good wrap up. And there you are. Texas, for a while, remains an independent nation. I believe in Great Britain, there was actually a consulate of the Republic of Texas, which has been turned into a restaurant that you can go there today.
Oh, that's cool.
So whatever the name of the restaurant is has something to do with the consulate of the Republic of Texas. There were Texas diplomats. They're probably planning to set up different embassies across Europe, but then it becomes a state, and the rest is history. I didn't get a chance to look this up. There's the common fact I've heard that the Texas flag is the only flag that's legally allowed to fly equal to the American flag due to a term of Texas joining the Union. I've heard somewhere that that's made up. It's custom to place a state flag before the national flag, but there's nothing preventing a state flag being flown at the same height. It might be custom and nothing legal. So that's my little bit of Texas historical trivia.
Yeah, there's a lot of things like that Texas can secede at any time, or that it can split into 4 states. A whole bunch of things like that are questionable.
Six Flags Park, named that because there were 6 sovereign flags that flew over Texas in its history. Spain, France, Mexico, Texas, the Confederacy, and the United States. There you are.
Yeah, that's a cool little fact, too.
So, what do you think, Steve? I guess there's a lot liked about this movie, so what were some of your favorite things?
I loved that the characters were really well played. They had a really good cast. I thought that, you can't get enough Jason Patrick. Patrick Wilson's pretty good. Billy Bob Thornton as Davy Crockett's one of the best of all times. And one of Thornton's best roles, I think. And it was a beautiful movie. It was shot somewhere in Texas. You can see they did put a lot of money into the movie. The sets are really good. The clothes are really good. I mean, I think the clothes were pretty period, and I think they spent a lot of time on making the clothing as period as possible. And they did a really good job of showing the Mexican side as well. They showed Santa Anna as kind of buffoonish, kind of clownish, which he kind of was. I mean, that's part of he was a bigger than life character, and they maybe played that up a little bit, but he was a complicated guy.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and I think from something I read, is part of the reason there was a lot of money in the set design is that Ron Howard was originally set by the studio to direct the movie. For whatever reason, he backed out, but with a bigger name director, you could probably also get full-fledged A-listers. So this is set in the early 2000s-ish, whoever would have been big there, Brad Pitt, Russell Crowe, whoever, some marquee star to be there. You don't quite have that with this movie, so with less money having to be paid out to an A-lister, then you can spend more on the actual film production and the set design and costumes and other stuff.
Yeah, I think they said that Russell Crowe was going to be Sam Houston, and I think Dennis Quaid played a much better Sam Houston than Russell Crowe would have.
Yeah, which, I thought Master and Commander, that would have been another film possibility for the series, which Russell Crowe was in. That's neither here nor there. But
yeah, he's done his fair amount of historical pieces. Oh, yeah, and Dennis Quaid is from Texas. He's from Houston. So I think it'd be a lot of the actors actually were Texans. Billy Bob Thornton I think he's from either Texas or he might be from Arkansas. But there were some other Texan actors in there as well.
Nice. Any other high points you think for this film?
I think that those are the big ones that I really liked. Is that it was overall probably about as accurate as you can get in a major motion picture, and that the battle scenes were accurate and it was fun to watch. I think they balanced those two things out as well as any movie, really.
Yeah, and something I like too is that it captures the epicness of the event and why we remember it, but it also doesn't make it out to be something that it wasn't, and this archetypal moment where the characters are practically looking into the future and speaking of the significance of this moment and making significance when it didn't exist. And what I mean by that is, from what I've read of the John Wayne movie, you mentioned that it had created perceptions of the Alamo that have stayed in the American conscious. And one point is that the characters seem to, they purposely decide to stay and not try to sneak out of the Alamo or go over a wall one night, with the idea that they can slow down the Mexican army and give Sam Houston enough time for total victory. You mentioned earlier that Goliad probably had much more to do with that than the Alamo, since the Alamo simply wasn't that much more. It wasn't a major fortification. There weren't that many people there. Incredible symbolic value, but in terms of overall military strategic value, much smaller. And so the John Wayne movie doesn't get that. I think this one captures the... not that it was meaningless, but I think the soldiers they were more just trapped in. It's not like they had a courageous, symbolic, decision to stand and fight. So that's something there that I think it would be easy to kind of gloss over and miss on. But
it's been a long time since I saw the John Wayne version, but he did one of his I do remember his classic looking out into the horizon and giving the prophetic speech, the classic John Wayne. We saw it in The Conqueror. He did it in The Green Beret.
He's like speaking with destiny itself as he's talking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's John Wayne, and they did not do any of that in this movie.
Right. So what would you say to make it better?
I think to make it better, now the Alamo, that's obviously the money. That's what everybody remembers. But I think if there was a way that the Goliad massacre could get fit in there, I think that's really important. The battle cry at San Jacinto was not just remember the Alamo. It was remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. Goliad was huge. And I think that that's really if they could have maybe, I mean, now you're talking about getting back into miniseries country. I think I would like to see a little bit more about the Mexican side, especially how they got themselves mobilized to do a really incredible march through the entirety of Mexico to get to Texas. That would have been really interesting. And just a little bit more about Goliad.
Yeah, I think I really don't have that many arguments. Because, for example, the movie does do a pretty good job of showing the Mexican side. So Juan Seguin, the main Tejano ally, he works with them to fight the dictator. And one thing in the movie is that Santa Anna, it somehow makes a point that he kills prisoners because he fears that Mexico's independence could be taken away if their grandchildren are ruled by Americans. That seems more like him making a prophetic statement where he's somehow speaking to future tensions between Mexico and the United States, but his actions were more just his policy of maybe a scorched earth. I guess you could call it a Sherman's March to the Sea, Curtis LeMay, the general who architected the firebombing of Tokyo, that let us do harsh now so that we can save lives in the future, which is one philosophy of how to conduct warfare. But it wasn't for any sort of let's do this now for the future of Mexican-American relations. That's a small quibble because really, I think, a lesser director and a lesser screenwriter would have just stuffed this to the gills with contemporary commentary on, the immigration debate. Because, like we said, there's that low-hanging fruit of Americans coming illegally into Mexico. And that's why I hate Kingdom of Heaven so much, because when I was writing up a description of that first series, I wrote, Legolas the elf travels to the Middle East to create universal harmony between Muslims and Christians. And he might as well wear a shirt that says tolerance or coexist for how anachronistic he is, because there's a great story to be told of the Crusades. And it's religious violence. Religious violence is terrible, but
it makes a good story.
Yeah, there's something to be gained by understanding why people in the past did things, even if you don't agree with it, so you can be transported to another world. But a lazy writer is, I'm going to make a commentary on the Iraq War, the 2005. Well, why not just make a Iraq War movie and then do it that way? And the Alamo, a lesser director, could have made a direct allegory for U.S.-Mexico relations and the immigration debate, but it didn't do that. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think it was a good period piece that stuck to the history. And I would just highly suggest people go watch it. It's available on all the streaming services, etc. I think sometimes it's even available on Netflix for free. So I would definitely go watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Steve, anything else on the Alamo?
No, I think we're good. I think I made the case that it's a movie that people should go and watch, and I think they're going to love it.
Absolutely. All right, in the next episode, we're going to talk about another movie that was loved, specifically by me. We're going to look at the 2014 schlock masterpiece, Dracula Untold.